Hello, and welcome to Loneliness and You, a podcast on the research and experience of loneliness. I'm your host, Axel Seeman. My guest today is Prasanta Verma. Prasanta Verma was born under an Asian sun, raised in the Appalachian foothills, and currently resides in the Midwest. She's an award-winning writer, author, speaker, former speech and debate coach, and works in public health and the healthcare industry. Her writing has been published in numerous places and print and online, and her first book, Beyond Ethnic Loneliness, released in April 2024. When she's not working or writing, she enjoys reading, walking, and traveling. You can connect with her on her website, prasantaverma.com, or through her Substack newsletter, Belonging and the Human Experience. Prasanta, welcome. I'm so pleased to have you.
Delighted to be with you here today, Axel.
Wonderful. Here in our second series, we are inviting our guests to bring an item that they associate with loneliness to share with me and the audience. Prasanta, what have you brought us?
Well, today I have brought you a scarf and I'm holding it up. But for those who are listening, it is a scarf that comes from India. And I brought this, it's sort of decorated with a traditional Indian pattern. And I brought it because it symbolizes my ethnic identity, my story, who I am, and a part of my life that is a little different from my life in the United States. And it helps me to remember and to connect with my heritage. But also, the scarf is something that is worn all over the world by people of all ages and ethnic identities, and male and females wear scarves for different reasons. We wear scarves when it's cold outside, but the scarf is just something that is part of the daily costume of somebody from India. And I just brought it because it reminds me of, my ethnic identity.
It's a beautiful scarf. Do you wear it in the US? Do you wear it in everyday life?
Actually, I wear it more often when I'm going to an Indian event. And occasionally I'll wear something if I feel like it's appropriate. It's not part of my daily wear though here, usually.
Okay, thank you. So you've just begun to tell us about your ethnic identity, and you have, written a book that's called Beyond Ethnic Loneliness. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about, what ethnic identity means and what it means for you?
Sure. So when I talk about ethnic identity and ethnic loneliness, I'm talking about that experience when we feel disconnected or culturally isolated as a result of our cultural or ethnic identity.
Okay, perhaps it'll be useful for our listeners if you told us a little bit more about your ethnic identity, how you would describe that, how you would describe your experiences that brought you to this very place where we're talking to each other.
hmm Yeah, that's a good question. So, what happened for me is my parents are immigrants from India, and they came to the United States when I was 1 year old. And back then, after the 1965 had the Immigration and Nationality Act, when they opened up immigration to people from Asia and Africa, that's what opened the doors for my parents to come. And we ended up settling out of the places where most of the Indian people were going and other internationals were going. We ended up in a small town in rural Alabama. And we were the first Indian immigrants in that area. People had never met or seen anyone from India, probably. So that's the start of my experience and this exploration of ethnic identity and loneliness. And that was a part of our story growing up feeling isolated in this area.
Yeah. And what was that like? This is an experience that very many of our listeners, including myself, won't have had access to at all. So, what was that like growing up as a recent immigrant in this small town?
Well, I will say that there were both positives and negatives. I will say that, there were people that were very welcoming and wanted us there. Part of the story that I have to share is that, my father is he's a physician. So when you come, we're coming with a sort of a place of privilege in the fact that he was very well educated. And that's what allowed us to come back then. And so people were very welcoming. They rolled out the red carpet for him because they were in desperate need of a physician in that area. They needed medical services and they wanted someone who would come and stay. So there was that aspect. But then there were also people who did not want us there. And I share some of the stories in the book of some examples of people who just didn't think we should be there, we didn't belong there, that we should get out of the South, and that's not where we should be.
Mhm.
So it was some of both.
Yeah. Like one instance that you talk about quite movingly in your book that stuck to my mind was that in your living room behind a curtain, you had an altar, didn't you? And at
Mhm.
some stage, the curtain accidentally got ripped down. Do you want to tell us a little bit what that was like?
Yeah, so that was interesting when I was in school, I think middle school. I had some friends over. Some girls came over to hang out at my house. And downstairs in one of the rooms, my mother had set up a little prayer altar. And in many Indian homes, you will find this. You'll find a little prayer altar which they have set up for their prayers and their private times of praying. And so that's not at all unusual for an Indian home. But it is unusual for a small, a town in Alabama to have this kind of altar set up with my parents, Hindu deities and, their little prayer altar. And that was a surprise. And what happened was it was like a divider that had sort of a not glass exactly, but some sort of plastic material that fell over and it shattered to pieces. Went with all my friends there and the commotion of just being in that room. And I was not so much scared about getting in trouble for the that object falling and breaking into pieces. I was more worried about what my friends would think about this thing they probably thought was really weird. And they would go home and they'd tell their families, "Oh, we have to tell you what we saw in this lady's house or in my friend's house. She had this, weird little statue set up and incense." And that's what I was afraid of. Yeah, I was afraid of us being shunned or more isolated, or they wouldn't be allowed to come to my house anymore, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And, this little scenario illustrates, I think, very well the particular situation that you found yourself in. So, sort of, it's not that you were friendless all by yourself. You clearly had friends and your father was somebody in the community, but you were also really different. And so, you write in your book about, these in between spaces being sort of the perpetual foreigner, right? Do you want to talk about
Mhm.
that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think people who are of a different identity, ethnic identity, who find themselves in the minority, we're often treated as foreigners. And in the spaces that we go, we're often asked, so what where are you from? Or so what are you? And when you ask that question, it automatically sort of sets up this line of, oh, I'm recognizing that there's something different about you. Maybe you're not from here, and I am, from America, but you aren't. So I think that feeling that we carry with us, because when we walk into spaces, we're not entirely sure how people are going to respond to us. Are they going to sort of welcome us and say, "Oh yes, welcome. You have a sense of belonging with this group," or you aren't exactly sure if you will be, um, whether you might be regarded with suspicion or with fear, or even curiosity, which is not a bad thing. Curiosity is what I think we need. We need good and healthy curiosity to learn about each other, but it's carrying that feeling of always being foreign, being perpetually foreign and unknown, and your sense of belonging is uncertain.
And that then can lead to a particular kind of loneliness. And that's what the book is mostly about.
Hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
And so what I write about is, I share that I sort of talk about, I refer to them as ghost lives.
Mm.
And these are those parts of our lives that we put aside because we're feeling this sense of loneliness. So we put our true identities or parts of our authentic selves to the side, and we try to assimilate or we try to fit in. And so I picture this as us having ghost lives, parts of our lives that are not, they're existing, but not really existing in front.
Mm. Yeah. And somewhere you call this a sort of way of living both hyper visibly and invisibly, right, at the same time. That's what you mean when you use these
Mhm.
terms.
Yeah. Yeah. I talk about when we are living as perpetual foreigners and we have these ghost lives. There are times when we feel just very visible and we are noticed and people see us and they recognize, oh, there's somebody different in this room, or I see a person of a different race or a different ethnic identity. And so then we're put front and center. And sometimes politics will do that. World, political events or current events will thrust us into the spotlight. For example, during the pandemic, when it was referred to as the China virus, well, all of a sudden, Asian Americans were thrust into the spotlight, and in a sort of a negative way. So those are times when we are hyper visible, and we don't necessarily want to be. But then there's also we live with a sense of invisibility, and that I think comes from part of our history of racial relations in the United States with traditionally black and white. And I'm talking right now specifically as somebody from Asia or a brown person who feels a little left out of that conversation at times. So that's another kind of invisibility that I think some of us experience. But I think invisibility in general means that we have typically and historically been left out of the conversation. We've been left out of positions of platform, and we are not always represented with a voice in the room to share our perspective or our experiences. And that is also a sense of our invisibility.
Yeah. And would it be fair to say that the ethnic loneliness that you are writing about, that you're interested in, that it mainly resides, or one of the things in which it manifests itself is this invisibility, is that, your concerns and your being is not taken up properly in some way by the people and the culture that surrounds you. Is that what the loneliness consists in?
I think that's part of it for sure. I think that it definitely is a component of what that consists in. The loneliness of not having your side heard, your perspective shared or listened to. But also, I think in spaces, geographical spaces, I think there's multiple layers of that loneliness. For example, where I grew up, there was nobody who looked like me. I didn't have a pal to talk to who could understand what it's like to live in my skin. So that is another kind of loneliness. And even if you are living in an area where there are multiple people who look like you, there's also a sense of loneliness because maybe your community doesn't understand you and you're living in that liminal space of belonging to the wider culture, majority culture, but yet you're also part of your community culture. So you're living in this liminal space. So there's multiple ways that you can feel lonely.
Mhm. And one of these ways, so you just describe about yourself that, well, somebody who encounters you, may classify you as Indian, say, but that's not actually your identity, right? You're Punjabi, and that's different, but people don't know about that. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, that's interesting you ask about that. So, yeah, I do mention that in the book because part of our I think our stories is that we have such complex stories behind us, and when somebody asks you where you're from, or they just look at you, maybe Axel, for you, maybe you also experience maybe a little bit of this, I'm not sure. But so when people look at me, first of all, they may not know my where I'm from, and if I say I'm from India, well, that's not the full story, because India is such a vast diverse country. And we wouldn't expect somebody from California to be the same as somebody from Alabama or New York City or North Dakota or Missouri. In India, it's the same way. In fact, it's even more so because every state has its own language. They have their own food, they have their own way of dressing, their own dance styles. So there's a wide variety of diversity within India itself. So when I say I'm from India, that's not actually not even the full story,
Mhm.
because I am from Punjab, as you said, I'm Punjabi, and that has a whole meaning to it. That means I speak a different language. That means, I may be of a particular religion, and there's multiple religions within Punjab. It could be, the way that I eat, my dancing that I like. There's all kinds of parts of
Yeah.
that background.
Yeah, I can relate to that a little bit. Like, some people in the US mostly experience me as British, but I'm actually not. I'm German, but I was socialized, in the UK for a long time. And mostly I just say when people say, "Oh, you're from the UK," and then I just let it roll because otherwise it gets too complicated and they don't need to know my whole life story. But so a little bit of what you're talking about, I can actually sort of relate to. Yeah.
Mhm.
And it's both like, in my case, there's no discrimination involved, as it will be the case for, many people who are from more radically elsewhere than I am. But it's this sort of weird in between space where, yeah, they know something about you, but you know that what they think they know about you is not actually what's the case. And it's sort of, yeah, creates a weird feeling a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is. And so there's this whole part of your life that people can't relate to or they don't know about, right? If you were raised in the United States and that is a specific kind of experience, right? But I was also raised in the United States, but I also have this cultural background and experience. So I think that yeah, there's more to it when we
Mhm.
get to know people and we start to learn the stories as we become more multi-ethnic in the United States itself. I think we're starting to have these conversations more and more.
Yeah, which is of course good and rich and wonderful. But then of course here we are, and we both live in the US and we're from elsewhere, and then we sometimes go back, right? And that in itself is an interesting and weird experience because you don't really go back to the place that sort of you came from originally because you have changed, right? You have of course taken on something of your new country, and so it's not as if, this way of going back would just be this simple homecoming and everything snaps right back in, right? It's not like that, is it?
No, and also it's not only that we've changed, but the countries that we come from have changed too. Because like I'm just thinking about my parents who have uh, assimilated in the United States and have been living here for most of their lives now. And when they go back to India, they find a completely different country. It is not what they remembered. It is not what they grew up with. It has also completely changed. So there's this kind of newness, like, okay, what is this country? What are these new things? And there's this new kind of shift that has to happen in what we understood our country to be. So that's also a very interesting experience.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then you feel like, there's another loneliness there because you feel like, okay, well, I said I was from India, but I've been living in the United States for all these years. But when I go back to India, it's not the same country that I knew. And then I know that I'm in America, but it's not really my home country. So, well, where is my country? What happened to it? Where did it go?
Yeah.
And so that's a new, different kind of disbelonging.
Yeah. I mean, in my experience, yes, it's this belonging. It also makes you free, sort of more positively connoted, right? You have a way to create yourself, recreate yourself in your own image that you wouldn't have had you stayed put. Do you ever have that thought?
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful thing too, because I think that we're constantly doing that. And I think that each generation of immigrants are going through that process. So for the next generation, they're going to have a completely different experience of what it is to be living here than I had. And there are going to be more people that look like them, perhaps, or, we are having more conversations. It doesn't mean that all the work is done, but it means that it's a completely different experience. And yes, I feel that it makes me um, a hopefully more empathetic person, someone who wants to be curious, to know about other people and their stories, to be from this background.
Yeah. So the second part of your book, asks the super important question, what can be done? And you begin the second part of the book by talking about systemic trauma. So,
Mm.
sort of the case where, yeah, it's not that, we feel a bit left out sometimes, but it's also beautiful and a chance. And you talk in particular about people of color get badly mentally hurt by not being recognized. So do you want to talk about that a little bit before we talk about what can be done to make it better?
Hmm. Right. I'm glad you said that because the topic of trauma is really a big one, and I'm sure that you've maybe hit on that, but it's a very long topic and a deep topic. So studies have found that they've studied epigenetics. I'm sure you've talked about that, and they've studied Holocaust survivors and other populations, and they found that this trauma actually passes down in the genes, and that they can see evidence of the generational trauma in the children of people who have experienced these horrible and horrific things. And so it does pass down to us biologically and physiologically, but also the trauma is in the things that we are not sharing. Because there's so many people that, when you talk to people who've been through the Holocaust or through wars, they don't want to talk about it. And so there are these whole experiences of past um, difficulties that are not shared with the future generations. And then the future generations there's just this desire to know and to understand, okay, well, what is that story that you're not telling me? So this trauma gets passed down, and it is trauma. And the interesting thing though about loneliness is that, it's been called an epidemic, and we know that there are physiological and physical ramifications of loneliness and emotional and social. But we have no diagnosis. There's no diagnostic code for it. You can't go to the doctor's office and get a pill. It's not like that. But for some of these other things like depression and
Mhm.
some of the we actually do have a diagnostic code for PTSD now. So, but that wasn't always the case. So perhaps we're on the journey to understanding more about loneliness. And sometimes people call it a cluster of emotions and feelings. So maybe we're on track to get there. But the interesting thing is, like, right now we're still even trying to define it. We're still trying to explain it, and how it manifests in all of us. And so trauma is part of it. Trauma is part of our experience. And one of the things that, as your listeners are listening in, Axel, is that the people that you meet from other ethnicities and racial backgrounds carry that aspects of that trauma with them. And we don't actually know what it is. It could be their own, or it could be their ancestors or their family members, more immediate family members, or, descendants. And so that's one of the things to remember, that as we have conversations and meet people, is that they're carrying stories of trauma within them.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. A super important topic, on many fronts. So first of all, you're right. We struggle to spell out what loneliness is. It's one of these, topics where everybody seems to know on an intuitive level what that is for yourself, but to define it or, describe it in such a way that you can devise efficient remedial measures turns out to be horrifically difficult. And I would completely agree that, we haven't gotten there yet. We're working on it, but it's not there. And then, of course, the matter gets made more complicated if the loneliness is collective in a way. And if it's, sort of perhaps due to a generational trauma that's been passed on, to tease that out and make it objectively describable is, of course, a big, massive task. And we've only begun, I think, to try to tackle it. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah. You end though on or rather not you end, but the second part of your book is meant as a constructive contribution. What can we do to begin to address this work? And so, in the few minutes that we've got left, I would like to talk about that because that's super important too. What can we do?
Yeah, that's a really big question. So, one of the things that I suggest is, besides dealing with your own trauma and your own experiences for the individual who's the person of color, I think one of the important things for us as a society, I think, is sharing our stories and listening to the multiple stories that we have around us. I think that's super important because storytelling has a way of reaching, I think, to the depths of a person's mind and heart, more so than data, more so than numbers. But when we hear a story, we can try to imagine ourselves in the shoes of that person. And so when we can try to imagine what it would be like for us, we develop greater empathy and understanding of each other. I think another important thing, and there's so many to talk about, but I think another important thing I might want to mention is proximity to one another. And I say that with a grain of salt, with just caution that proximity doesn't solve all of our problems, but we can't actually do many things without proximity, because when we are in a room and we're having a conversation and we can see each other and we can be aware of the tone, and there's something that doesn't happen neurologically when we are on a screen, and we're more likely to be willing to engage with somebody in more positive ways in person. Whereas if we're just engaging on a screen, there's more likely to be hostility, and we'll say and do things online that we would never do in person. So I think it's super important to find ways for us to engage in proximity and in person, recognizing that technology is a wonderful tool and we use it, but yet it's not a substitute also for in-person connection and creating a sense of belonging that you have to have. We want that sense of belonging in society. So
Yeah. So, sort of this is then a perspective that goes beyond the concerns of mental health, say. At the end of the day, it also has to do with things like urban planning or something. Like, sort of
oh
each of
yeah.
us just sit, in our little houses, and we drive in our little cars, and we never interact. And so we never get to meet other people, and in particular, not, people who really are different from us in some ways. Then it's impossible to empathize. And so, this is really, on the most fundamental level, a question about how we want to structure our being together in the world.
Absolutely. I think that that's absolutely right. Urban planning and the way that we've designed our neighborhoods, the way that we live and work is more and more isolated from each other. We are separating ourselves further and further. And absolutely it has more ramifications than just our own selves. It's how we want to live and how we want to be.
Yeah. So I want to close in the little time that we've got. Towards the end of the book, you write about something that really stuck with me, and you say, look, betweenness is, yes, there's difficulties, but it's also a superpower, right? Betweenness is a superpower. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think that our in-betweenness and our loneliness, I think is something that it is actually a gift. And loneliness is one of those things that I think that it's part of our existence, but it's also a sign. It's a sign that we need to pay attention to, that something is amiss, that hey, why do I feel this way? That maybe I am not really being as connected to other people as I should. But our in-betweenness, we have a unique perspective to offer. And our belonging and our presence is a gift. Our unique perspective is a gift. It's a creative energy that we bring by being who we are and our unique selves. And so I think there's a lot of power in that. And I think it's something that we need to engage and adapt and believe in. Believe in this power of being who you are, and your in betweenness is it's important.
Yeah, such an important message, because, loneliness can feel like the thing that drags you down, that isolates you, that, makes it impossible for you to interact and to be with others. And the more you're driven, into this corner, the more difficult it can seem to get out of it again. And bearing that in mind, I think it's so important to highlight that loneliness can also empower you to, change things for the better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's gifts found in our loneliness. And by embracing those gifts, we can bring those gifts and bring them out into the open and serve other people and just make our humanity more lively and enriching.
Yes, because that's what humanity is, right? It's lively and it's rich and it's got many different perspectives in it. And that's a big part of the beauty of being alive.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. I think this is a great way to end, Prasanta. I want to thank you so much for being part of our conversation today. I enjoyed it a lot to talk to you, and I wish you all the best in your work.
Well, thank you so much. It was delightful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Loneliness and You, a podcast on the research and experience of loneliness. My guest today was Prasanta Verma. If you want to join the conversation or have suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at lonelinnesspod@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Instagram and TikTok at loneliness.pod. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Loneliness and You wherever you get your podcasts. It will help others find our work. Loneliness and You is produced by Stacey Goldman and myself, Axel Seemann. Our podcast is engineered and edited by Steve Selina. Our introductory sound was designed by Dave Meckin, and our logo art is by Paul Fisher-Davies. The podcast is financially supported by Bentley University. Thanks for listening. Talk soon.